Welcome to Issam Fares Institute for Public Policy and International Affairs and to this panel discussion organized by the Climate Change and Environment in the Arab World program. Science has proven that climate change is not merely an environmental problem, but also a social and economic threat. Accordingly, understanding the economics of climate change, which offers theoretical insights and empirical findings, becomes an important prerequisite of any policy planning process in the reality of climate change. With that in mind, we are holding this panel discussion today on the economics of climate change, the cost of doing nothing, with examples from Lebanon, the region, Brazil, and the United States of America. The panel is going to be divided into two parts, and we will be starting with two presentations on Lebanon, followed by a Q&A session, and then a short break before continuing with our second part. The first presentation by Dr. Nadim Farajalla will be on the economic impacts of the drought that took place in Lebanon during the year 2013 and 2014 on different sectors. This is a presentation based on a study that was conducted by the Climate Change Program at IFI. Dr. Nadim Farajalla is an associate professor of environmental hydrology at the Faculty of Agricultural and Food Sciences and the faculty research director of the Climate Change and Environment in the Arab World program at IFI AUB. He received his PhD in environmental engineering from the University of Oklahoma in 1995. Previous to joining AUB, he had served as a senior scientist at Stone Environmental and as a senior environmental engineer on major environmental and infrastructure projects in Lebanon, the region, and Africa. His proficiency areas include climate change impact and adaptation, water resources management, specifically sustainable water management practices. The second presentation by Mrs. Leila Sayed will be on the optimal renewable energy mix of the power sector by 2020, investment cost implications for Lebanon. Leila Sayed is an economist working for the United Nations Development Program at the Lebanese Ministry of Environment and Finance. She is responsible for conducting economic and financial studies in the climate change context. She is currently involved in developing optimization and simulation tools for the assessment of fiscal policies aimed at reducing greenhouse gas emissions in the Lebanese energy sector. She holds a master's in science and decision sciences from the London School of Economics, the UK, and an MA in financial economics from the University of Leeds. We will start with Dr. Farajalla. Go ahead.
Thank you, Rana. Good morning, everyone. It's a great opportunity for us here to have you with us, and especially to have our esteemed guests from the US and Brazil. What I'm trying to present here today is just hot off the press, as it were, in parts. We presented a little part of it. We've accomplished our work a little part earlier, and we're doing the add-on now. We're looking at last year's drought. For those that were not here, we went through a drought last year that was pretty severe. And we thought that we'd look at what that cost us as a community and as a nation. So just before I start, I just want to give you a brief background about our water resources in Lebanon. Lebanon's precipitation on average annually is around 8.6 billion cubic meters overall, and we lose half of that, practically a little bit more, to evaporation and evapotranspiration. And we get flows that go into the sea and across the border, and most of which then the remainder of which we use in Lebanon is around 2.7 billion that's left for us for use and distribution. Right now we're at slightly below the 1,000 cubic meter per capita per year level. So we are in a water scarce country where we're stressed. And this is why managing this resource and looking at what affects it is important. Lebanon's population is 4.4 million, and our population growth rate is lowered down to about less than 1%. However, we have extremely high population density, especially along the coast, with around 1,550 people per square meter. 67% of the population lives along the coast, leaving around 12% in rural areas. We've got two larger cities in inland. That puts most of our population in an urban setting, around 80%. Lebanon's population problem is not necessarily one of growth, but one of refugees. We have around 425,000 Palestinians living in different camps, and we had an influx of Syrians because of the war in Syria, and the number now stands around 1.8 million, if not more. The official figure by UNHCR is around 1.4 million. However, they themselves say that it's a bit more than that. So 1.8 to 2 million is not an unrealistic number. What are the stressors? We have the major stressor, if you will, and that we anticipate on our water resources, is climate change. And through that, when we look at it, we look at precipitation trends and patterns that are changing, and we're having more intense storms occurring. Our average rainfall has not really changed over the past 100 years as a total, but the way it falls and the pattern that it follows in falling has changed. And you can see in these two pictures that we have here, the flooding that we often get during winter. And the picture here on the side is for about 12 years of changing snow cover. And you can see, especially last year, the middle right one, this one here, that's last year's snow. And this is 2010 snow cover, which is really low. That's in a ski resort in Farajalla. So we are moving towards intense storms that come in briefly and go away, leaving us with such damage. And we're getting less and less snow cover, which is the basic resource, water resource that charges our groundwater. Since 1920, going in a break, if you look at it, from 1920 to 2003, we had about 8 major drought incidents. And if you look at it, it's staggered between once every 20 years. We experienced that, but it is bunched up towards the later part in 2003. As a rule of thumb, let me caveat this first. We don't have nationally a good drought study as to how frequent the drought is and the extent of the drought, time-wise and damage-wise. But as a rule of thumb, we have a drought every 6 to 10 years, a form of drought, and that is repeated once every 6 to 10 years. And this is born towards the end half of the last century. Last year's precipitation levels were really low. They were 40% of normal. The normal in this, when we compared the drought of 2014, which are the lines in red, to those of 2012, 2013, you could see the great difference. The pattern is practically the same. The pattern did not change. But the amount of water that fell was significantly less. On the left-hand side is Zahli. It's in the inner part of Lebanon, and Beirut on the coast. And this just shows you that it didn't matter whether you were along the coast or along the inner plain. It's the same. The drought hit Lebanon all over. And what is significant, if you look at the reduction in rain, and this is the top part, this is the number that goes below your average, okay, for rainfall, and the decrease in rain. For Zahli and for Beirut. And if you look at what the second national communication to the UNFCCC that the Ministry of Environment had put together, and you look at the patterns between the two, the top one and the bottom one, look at the bar chart, they look unbelievably alike. And this is what the modeling that the Ministry of Environment had done, the climate change unit had done at the Ministry of Environment. So this, for us, triggered this idea. Look, we had a drought. And this drought looks unbelievably like what is being predicted for Lebanon in the future. So let us look at what that means for Lebanon. What are we ready? Are we in a position to face such an event? And throughout the time leading up to the study, a lot of the people here at AUB and around Lebanon were raising, alarm and waving flags, telling people, look, we have a drought coming. It started. We even started here at AUB talking about this in November, December of that year, and saying, look, there's going to be a drought coming, November 2013. And the government's reaction was really what, led us to start the study in September. So what did we do? We decided we know that water is a cross-cutting issue, and the drought affected many sectors. But we chose sectors that we could actually manage and measure. And we talked for 3 economic sectors and households. We looked at industry, tourism, agriculture, and regular household use of water. And all these, the industry, tourism, and agriculture, account for nearly 45% of the economic output in Lebanon. So when we designed our surveys, we targeted 333 industries. And we talked to 104 farmers from all over Lebanon. This covered the entire country. We did not focus on one area. We covered the entire country. And we talked to nearly 500 tourism establishments. And the divisions of these establishments for industry, for example, we'll talk to chemical industries, food and beverage, leather, metal, non-mineral, paper, textile, all these industries were covered. And on the tourism side, we talked to country clubs, where they hold events, and hotels, restaurants, wedding venues, water parks, beach resorts, which plague the entire shore. And we talked to the major golf course here in Beirut. And these are the questions that we asked, and these are the answers that we have here. If we look at the dependency on private vendors, usually we're supposed to get water from the government to our houses. And when we don't, we look for alternative sources. And these alternative sources are private vendors, either through cisterns or basically, go fill out in a well, but pay for it. So the dependency on private vendors we compared 2014 to 2013. We didn't go farther back. We don't have information on that. And the questions that we asked were, to get the feedback from individuals. Some industries did go back to their numbers, but when we talk about households, it's the perception or what they anticipated. So in looking at agriculture, the reliance on private vendors rose by 17%, 22% in tourism, and 19% for industry. And there was an increase in the amount paid for that water, 23% in agriculture, 31% and 32% in tourism and industry. When we talked about water consumption, we couldn't really find the number for agriculture because of the variable usages and sources that they got, and farmers exactly don't know how much they're using. So we didn't get an answer on that. But there was a reduction in consumption in tourism and in industry, about the same. And what that got reflected in a change in prices. Agricultural commodities increased by 42%. Tourism facilities increased by 27%. The interesting number is the 2% hike by the industry. And this tells us that they could consume less water and raise their prices a little bit and still remain in business. So they can do things a little bit more efficiently. And we then asked each of these industries, how did you adapt to this reduction in water? And to start out with agriculture, 16% of farmers changed their cropping patterns. About 4% changed their irrigation system by installing drip technologies, using drip technologies. On average, it's around 4,000 per farmer. And this $4,000 per farmer. And this is a lot of money for farmers. It's not a small number. Very few, if any, changed their planting schedule. 4% again decided to either dig new wells, and that cost them about $10,000. Another 4% extended the depth of their wells and at a more exorbitant cost of $15,000. And there were other measures that were taken by farmers, and that was, we averaged the cost at around $2,200. For tourism, there was a technical adaptation that was followed and a behavioral. And this behavioral thing is quite important. Water treatment, 2% treated water more because what they were getting was not good enough water. And some tested the water that they would get, and that's at around $600. Others introduced water-saving technologies into their establishments at the cost of average cost per the 3% of 1,166. That's per establishment. These numbers, I'm telling you the dollar values per establishment. It's not overall. And some even 1% of the establishments we talked to dug up their own wells at $6,700. The behavioral change was they tried to reuse some of that water, multiple usages of those waters, water-saving procedures, turning off the tap when they can, and similar things. And then 38% at no cost tried to raise awareness amongst their workers to use less water. Similar approach was taken with the industry, behavioral and technological. Treatment of water was higher here at the cost of $11,000 because the quality of water that's used in industry was restrictive oftentimes. 4% tested water at $1,400. Use of water-saving equipment, $45,000. And that's a high number. And $21,000 for the 2% who changed, who drilled or increased the depth of their wells. Water use was more in industry, water reuse, as was the use of water-saving procedures. And the awareness campaigns were a little bit higher amongst the industry. When we talk to households, that's interesting. In Lebanon overall, the household distribution, 42% of households live in Mount Lebanon. Beirut, and that's not administrative Beirut, that's Beirut from Nahr Beirut to just north of the Medina Riyadiyya. Okay, that's Cité Sportive. And that's Beirut, that's 12%, Beqa is 12%, North Lebanon 18%, South Lebanon is 10%, and Nabatiya Governorate is 6%. We tried to reflect that in the households that we surveyed, and you can see the distribution is practically the same. Beirut got a little bit more, 19%, but that doesn't skew the results in any fashion. We talked to, most of the interviews were done by phone. And this 10 phone interviews with private vendors, I'll show you the results a little bit later. So we talked to households, and public payment, the amount paid by the household for water to the water establishments rate was high, 8% higher, and 14% less used that source. And when we look at the amount paid for the private sector, buying tankers, paying for tankers to come in, 71% of households surveyed bought water from tankers, and 71% more money, and 18% more households used that. Less money was paid for pumping from groundwater simply because the groundwater level dropped. And 4% of households increased. There was an increase of 4% of households that used that resource. Again, bottled drinking water, that market is sort of fixed to a greater extent, but there was an increase in amount paid of 8%. Reliance on spring water. That in Lebanon, for those that don't know, what we mean by spring water is going to a ayn, where there is a water coming out, a communal water that goes out, people go there, fill up their gallons and take them home. So 57% increase in price of that, and the reliance on that. The source dependency did not change that much. but the cost was higher. The consumption rate was lower across the board in all the governorates. Less water was consumed, but the change in cost was different. And you could see that in Beirut and in Mount Lebanon, where there is the highest number of the urban areas, the cost was highest in change in cost. And the change in dependency of source, again, was highest. In the areas that were more rural, Nabatiye, the south, and the Beqa, the change in source was a little bit lower, significantly lower than Beirut and Mount Lebanon, as was the change in cost. All exhibited an increase, but that was less for the households that were surveyed. Now, when we talked to private vendors, they said that they started selling water earlier that year. And some had to reduce their operating months due to lack of water. They had different sources that they accessed, and the water ran out. So they had to reduce their operating time. They started charging more simply because the pumping cost was higher, because they pumped longer, and they had to travel longer distances. They had more clients in farther areas. And the price increased by 25%. That's what they charged their customers. And the increase in demand was, they say, around 65%. And many recorded the use of saline water. Along the coast in Lebanon, we have great saltwater intrusion. And this is reflected in the quality of water. And if you look back, the industry and the tourism sector, they treated that water. Some because of fecal coliform in the water, some because of salinity issues. With all this going on, we looked towards the government. What was the government doing, and how did it react? There is a standing committee in the Parliament Committee for Public Works and Energy and Water, and they met in March. So we've already had several months of no rain. March, by the way, was the wetter month of that year. And they met and they said, establish a committee. And we all know, if you want to bury a cause, establish a committee for it. It dies. So that committee, that ministerial committee, met in May, and upon the recommendation of the Parliament. And what they did, the recommendation they came out with, that we need to monitor the situation in summer. And then they followed up. They said we need to follow up. The concerned institutions need to follow up and come up with the recommendations to overcome this crisis. That's May. And then they said they had to provide a solution to the Council of Ministers, the solution to this problem. And the summer went, and a task force was formed. The Water Security Task Force was formed, chaired by the Minister of Energy and Water, and it was established to address the challenges of the water crisis. Nothing. Okay? So what really resulted from this? So that was last year, and nobody's done anything about that since. So in July, the Parliamentary Committee for Public Works and Energy and Water labeled the drought a natural disaster and demanded the government announce a state of emergency concerning water. July. Okay, we're getting close to the new water year. And they suggested increase groundwater exploration, drill more wells, and then introduce drip irrigation to farmers. It's like closing the door after the horses run out. And reduce industrial consumption of water and promote water-saving methods. And the gem of it all, the crown jewel of all the recommendations, import water from Turkey. So these were really, it's shown. So what happened? Some, private water suppliers, new wells were drilled. And for Mount Lebanon, the water establishment for Beirut and Mount Lebanon drilled 2 wells because people were really running out of water. They didn't know what to do. They drilled 2 wells in the Jisr al-Adi area. And then, again, the crown jewel was a water conservation awareness campaign. We got nice billboards. And that's it. Nothing happened. Nothing. And now we got water and everybody's saying, hey, great, we have water now. So the past drought for us is an exact image of what's going to happen, what's going to be the normal situation in a few years. Not too long, in a few years. And Lebanon showed itself to be not ready, technically and legally, with no laws and regulations to help. Imagine we, as a government, could not order gasoline stations to stop washing cars. We could not stop concierges from hosing down the sidewalk. We could not stop Suclean from cleaning the corniche every morning, bringing in their tanker and washing the road, as if we were bathing in high-quality water. And we found that the high cost of drought on agriculture, tourism, and industry was fairly high. Really, it was a disaster for these people, especially the agriculture sector. And direct transfer of cost to the sector surveyed did not occur. There was no support whatsoever. So what do we recommend? Just briefly now. I mean, this is just quick thoughts. We have to have a national climate change adaptation strategy, because as we stand, we have no chance of surviving or decently the coming years. This strategy should provide policy entry points for mainstreaming adaptation in various sectors. It's not in one sector that we should work. This strategy should have provide an institutional framework for adaptation, should provide mechanisms for technical support and mechanisms for securing funding for adaptation. And then it should identify and support the vulnerable sectors and the communities within. And within that strategy, clearly we have to have a drought management plan, which should include, amongst others, this is not the totality of it. First, this management plan should conserve the water that we have. When we know that there's an emergency coming in, when we see a drought coming in, we should start with first conserving the available water. Have mechanisms in place, technical, regulatory, etc., that kick in to manage demand. For example, stop car wash, stop irrigating landscaped areas, stop hosing down sidewalks. And then have within that plan methods for identifying the drought. How long do we think it's going to extend? How severe is it going to be? That is important because that will help us set up a compensation plan that targets affected economic sectors. And within that, we have to be able to create a fund that would be fed on a continuous basis. So then once that disaster hits, we don't have to run around and try to find funding sources to support these targeted sectors. And then we can put this in place. And before I close, this work was done by a big team. And Patricia Heidamus, where is she? She is the backbone of this. She did a fantastic job with this. And we had support from Roland Riyeshi, Malak Tufaili, Sonia Zghaib, Sarah Halawani, Sarah Brahim, Berna Ismail, and Danilo Napoli. Roland gave guidance on this, and the remaining ladies worked on interviewing people. They put in very, very long hours. So this work and the report that's coming up soon, I hope, we'll be producing a thorough report on this in the coming couple of months. This will recognize these people as well. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Dr. Farajalla. Now we will move to Leila before our questions.
Thank you, Ran. So, hello everyone. This study, the optimal renewable energy mix for Lebanon, raising ambition from 12% to 20% by 2020, was done by the Climate Change Coordination Unit at the Ministry of Environment, and also benefited from the UNDP team working at the Ministry of Finance. I'll give you a quick background on first the energy situation in Lebanon and why we came to do this study. First, the government of Lebanon, through a ministerial declaration in 2009, has committed voluntarily to reach a target of 12% of total energy supply to come from renewable energy. So this is a voluntary commitment to be reached by 2020. The technical potential we have in Lebanon from 3 renewable energy sources from hydropower, wind power, and solar including photovoltaic and concentrated solar power technologies, amounts to huge potential, which is 215 million megawatt hours. Now, this is only the technical potential, not taking into consideration any economic proximity to the grid or environmental constraints. So the total technical potential is 215 million megawatt hours. The current electricity consumer tariff, the end consumers pay on average 9.3 cents per kilowatt hour, which is well below the production cost, which is at 26 cents per kilowatt hour. So we're making huge losses. In 2002, the Parliament adopted Law number 462, which is the only law which regulates the electricity sector, and it's about the regulation and organization of the electricity sector. The main objective of this study is to propose under a number of scenarios. You know, in Lebanon, we have many scenarios for the future, whether we pump natural gas or not, whether we are able to reach the demand, the deficit we have, to eliminate the deficit we have by 2020. We will propose what is the optimal renewable energy mix from each of these 3 technologies I mentioned to reach the 12% target. So since we have a voluntary target by 2020, we will look only at the cost criteria. So looking at the cost criteria, what is the optimal renewable energy mix? And also to look at the optimal mix for a more ambitious target of 20%. We have many aims. The first aim is to consider the potential capacity we have from the 3 hydropower, wind, and solar technologies. Second, we want to compare investment cost of these 3 renewable energy technologies to current thermal conventional plants running on diesel oil, heavy fuel oil, and in some years on natural gas. And finally, and the most important one, is to incorporate uncertainty in the assumptions we made, in the cost parameters we insert into our model. We want to incorporate the uncertainty, especially that for each of these 3 parameters, the capital costs, oil prices, and discount rates, these will be highly volatile in the coming 5 years. The modeling approach here is simulation optimization, which is compared to the conventional optimization modeling, it can handle a much larger number of scenarios, and by which we can incorporate uncertainty in the simulation part. So in the simulation part, we include a range of the cost. Instead of putting a definite number on the cost of each of the renewable energy sources, we are able to include a range and a number of scenarios where then we will optimize and bring about the output of the optimal mix. So this is the simulation part, the results of the simulation part, and the input parameters. We find that, and this is showing the levelized cost of electricity, which is a single cost parameter by which we can compare along all the technologies from thermal and renewable energy. We can compare the cost of building and producing electricity, cost in real dollars per kilowatt hour. So we find that the most expensive technology, of course, is the current conventional thermal power plants running on diesel oil. It's ranging between 23 cents and 57 cents per kilowatt hour. The most inefficient are ones that are open cycle power plants in Sur and Baalbek. These come to the higher level of 57 cents. Second, which is the case in many countries, is still expensive. This technology is the solar concentrated solar power plants. Then comes the conventional thermal power plants running on heavy fuel oil, like the ones in Zouk and Jiyeh. And then photovoltaic. And finally, the cheapest technology, renewable energy technology, is hydro. The lower range signifies the cost of just operating current power plants, hydroelectric power plants in Lebanon. And the upper range is of the least efficient potential hydro sites. Another input parameter where we take arranges is the oil prices. As you know, the oil prices are fluctuating significantly this year. We take the recent forecast by the International Energy Agency. So we look at year 2020 and we take the range of the lower green line and the upper red line. And the results, this is the results of the 12% case. So of course, thermal will be taking the rest. It will be taking the 88%. We have the current plants running on HFO. We eliminated the diesel power plants because these are the most expensive and we're operating only in cases of high demand in the summer and in the 2006 war. So the current plants are Zouq, Jiyeh, Deir Ammar, Zahrani. We assume new plants for HFO at around 17,000 gigawatt hour in order to meet the 88% of the demand by 2020. And the largest share among the 12% renewable energy goes to hydro, of course, because it's the cheapest. It signifies 28 new plants that need to be built giving around 1,200 gigawatt hour. The second largest share goes to solar at the most efficient areas in Lebanon at capacity factors of 20.8 and 20.1, which is considered high. And finally, with wind. This is the 20% case, and if you see the shift from 12% to 20%, we don't see a huge jump for hydro and solar shares, and wind shares. So the difference in 8% goes mainly to solar, which shows that in the 12% case, the most efficient and cost-effective areas in Lebanon and potential is already taken for hydro and wind, so the additional 8% will go to solar. And now the financial analysis. So we have 9 scenarios. We cover all possible scenarios that might happen in Lebanon. The business as usual scenario, we have also sub-scenarios under each. The business as usual scenario assumes that by 2020 we will still not be able to meet demand. So currently we're producing 12,000 gigawatt hours. The demand now is around 18,000 gigawatt hour. By 2020 it will go to around 30,000 gigawatt hour. So we're assuming that in the BAU scenario demand will only rise to the midterm levels of adding some additional power plants. In the BAU 12 scenario, it's the same as the BAU. We will also not meet demand, but we will have 12% renewable energy sources of the BAU. And the BAU 20 will have 20%. In the F1 scenarios, we're assuming that demand will be met by 2020, but mainly from adding power plants running on heavy fuel oil. So it will be similar power plants as the ones in Zouq and Jiyeh. The F112 scenario assumes 12% and F120 assumes 20%. F2 scenario, hopefully we will assume natural gas will be pumped from the sea. And we will have additional demand will be met from additional plants running on natural gas, local natural gas, and same for F212 and F220. I will go quickly over the assumptions we made in the financial analysis. We assume by nature of producing electricity from thermal and hydropower that these will be owned by the government. So the government will, the loss or the profit to the government will be the tariff, the end consumer tariff, minus the levelized cost of electricity or the production cost. Also for the end consumer tariff, we assume that it will be kept at 9.6 cents per kilowatt hour for the business as usual scenario. So we will not raise the tariff if we don't raise electricity supply. But we will be able to raise it to 14 cents if we meet demand. In the case of solar and wind, we assume that the government will not be able to cover all the costs, so there will be a space for private investments. Here we assume a feed-in tariff. A feed-in tariff is where the government will set a tariff for each of these technologies at different levels that it will pay to private investors for giving their own generation from solar and wind. So the profit or loss will be the end consumer tariff that it will get minus the feed-in tariff that it will pay to private investors. And these are the main results of the study. We have two layers of overall costs. We have the cost to the government, which is simply the cost of producing electricity. But then we see that in the cases where demand will not be met, there is a cost to the economy, which is the cost of not having electricity. This is normally calculated by the value of lost load. It's called the value of lost load. It includes what the consumer will have to pay for private generation, what the social cost of having a blackout or not having electricity. So unfortunately, we didn't have a local estimate for Lebanon. The electricity paper of the Ministry of Energy and Water adopted the value of lost load from EDF, Électricité de France. So we took that number. It's $700 per megawatt lost. So you see the middle row, additional cost to the economy. We have these numbers only for the BAU scenario, where we will not meet demand. And the final row is the mean total cost to the economy. Of course, as expected, the BAU scenario will have the highest cost to the economy. The numbers are huge. It's $10.7 billion per year for the BAU scenario. It's $8.2 billion per year for the BAU 20 scenario. The cheapest among all will be to the government in the case where we'll be able to pump natural gas and have additional demand from additional supply from natural gas. But what is interesting is that in all cases, whether we meet demand or not, whether we pump natural gas or not, moving from 12% to a more ambitious 20% in renewable energy will save huge annual money to the government. It's saying that in comparison, renewable energy, as compared to current or new conventional power plants, will be cheaper because we have huge potential in Lebanon. Also quickly, for the optimal renewable energy mix, the results of this study was included in the renewable energy strategy under the Ministry of Environment. And a strategic environmental assessment was done for this renewable energy strategy, including the optimal mix. This strategic environmental assessment considers many criteria in order to study the economic, social, and most importantly, the environmental impacts of having such a strategy with 12% renewable energy. Some of the criteria are here: effects on biodiversity, change in land use, visual aesthetics, effects on climate and air quality. The methodology used in the SEA is a significance impact matrix, where we will have each of the technologies and the shares and the impacts on each of these criteria. The recommendations from the SEA were mainly not to consider the important bird areas in Lebanon, so to eliminate any possible important bird areas in our mix. The second recommendation was to also eliminate the area of the Yamuni Nature Reserve, because this area was considered a high potential for solar, so this was eliminated. A third important recommendation was to eliminate the 4 potential hydropower plants and maybe include other potential hydropower plants in areas that are considered environmentally not very safe. And finally, the recommendation was to include an additional criteria, because the only criteria we had in our study was the cost. The additional criteria to include was the proximity to the grid, which is considered an obstacle for Lebanon because the high potential areas are not very close to the national grid. Like for wind, it's in the case of the north. So the recommendation was to include this criteria in our study. The general recommendations from the overall study is to implement Law 462 to allow private sector involvement in renewable energy production. So since it is not in the space of the government or not in the capabilities of the government to reach the full demand by 2020, we advise also to have a feed-in tariff that will allow private money to enter into the market. The end consumer tariff is advised to be increased to around 14 cents per kilowatt hour, only if we provide additional electricity generation and hopefully reach 24-hour electricity. And also for future studies, a good direction would be to include additional criteria that we were not able to include it in the study, including energy security, environmental factors, and investment risk factors to be incorporated. The full study can be found on our website at the Ministry of Environment, and I'm ready for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila. Okay, we will start now taking questions.
Well, my name is Adel Cortaz, former Minister of Agriculture. I was really very much interested in the two presentations made, but I would like to draw your attention very kindly to the fact that we have not said anything concerning water harvesting. Water harvesting as a measure of adaptation and mitigation to water scarcity and to climate change. My second point is related to the organizational and institutional follow-up which we have. I know that the Ministry of Energy, the Ministry of Environment is involved on this. But I am sorry to say that there is no dialogue between the Ministry of Environment and Lahr, for instance, or the Center for Research, the National Center for Research of Moin Hamzi. I think here it would be a pity that all this investment you have made, either through UNDP or other organization, that will not have a follow-up and a sustainable development for what you have already started. Thank you.
Hi, Karim Aid Sabah. I also just wanted to say, I thought the two studies were very interesting. They bring, ideas to think about policy, but especially in Mr. Farajalla's study, he starts pointing out, or you start pointing out, that the government did this or didn't do this, and what I find is missing a little bit is to address the initial problem. Is that, it sounds, everybody knows it, but it's the government that doesn't work. There's no regulation on anything. If I'm not mistaken, your salary is probably paid by the UN already, so the government doesn't even have the capacity to do any of it. So in the whole analysis here, what I feel missing is, the initial problem, and that's, if you can address that, be happy to hear something. Thank you.
One more question before we...
Mine's rather quick, which is, since agriculture is a major user, I was wondering, for example, I know Andalusia in Spain, they do they have a similar problem with drought. They produce clementines, actually exporting water. And I was wondering if anybody has looked at that issue for Lebanon. What goods are being produced and are they being exported? Maybe they should reconsider what crops are being grown.
Okay, let's answer.
I'll go one by one. Dr. Cortas, I agree we didn't mention water harvesting, but we didn't mention any adaptation technology and technique. Ours is not just to mention what the technologies are. There are plenty, and I totally agree. We're not using enough of water harvesting in Lebanon in totality. But in the main purpose of what we presented was show that we are inadequately prepared financially, in a regulatory or even in community sense, to adapt to climate change and to adapt to a reduced amount of rainfall. Yes, that I agree we didn't mention. We will, in our report, which is coming out, we will mention, go into much more detail about policy and issues. And this comes to Karim's question. The government is not totally inadequate. And if I may be wrong, but the UNDP salaries are paid by the government to the UNDP, and the UNDP pays the staff, not in totality. But the root cause is the government inadequacy, yes. But when you are faced with a disaster or a potential disaster, and neither the government, and then we should have said more clearly, none of us in this country. Did you stop washing your car? Oh, excellent. No, but many people didn't stop washing their cars. Their behavior did not change on a general level. And even if the behavior did change on a personal level, there was nothing demanded by the government, from the government by the people. So this is something that we really need to take stock of and move forward on. We cannot keep saying, well, the government is inadequate, what do we do? Don't do anything. There are methods of, we're working on it, but for us to be able to force people to take action, you cannot do it as an individual, the government has to do it. And you have to work through legal forms. And this is what we're asking for, and this is what we're trying to lay out and identify. We do not in Lebanon have a drought management. We do not. So we have to have that in place before we can even start complaining about the government not doing its share as well. So just one more. I'm not going to get into the debate right now, but we can talk about that later. For virtual water, we don't control what farmers grow. And we try to, I tell them, guide them. But farmers grow what they can make money off. And a lot of farmers in the Beirut don't even grow legal crops. They grow illegal crops and to make a living. So, and by the way, that's one of the most drought-resistant crops we have. And many have supported its medicinal use and growth for medicinal purposes. But yes, virtual water has been looked into in Lebanon, but we are a net importer of food rather than net exporter in that sense.
Dr. Cortaz, just to answer to your question, I've been working with UNDP and the Ministry of Finance and the Ministry of Environment for 2 years. And I work for the Climate Change Coordination Unit, which the main aim for this unit is to mainstream climate change into different institutions and ministries. And so far, under just these 2 years, we've seen, a lot of momentum and change, where we can see that the climate change, as even if it's just said or included in a component, in a strategy, in a study, because the Ministry of Environment and the UNDP team there and other institutions are being more aware that it's getting more involved and more important year by year. I'm talking only institutionally, not by the public. It's being more integrated into the daily work and daily studies and the strategies. And Lahr is one of the focal points we have at the unit, and we're always in coordination for new studies to make sure that we benefit from their output and they benefit from ours. For your question, everyone knows that policies and studies and people working, the change is slow. Climate change is maybe changing faster, but we are hopeful as people working at the Ministry of Environment. I think we are hopeful. We're seeing a bit of change, and we have to stay positive, and we have to do our work. These kinds of assessment and these kinds of studies have to be done. Policy recommendations have always to be given to the government, and they have to be always updated and there. So when the government is ready, it will take it into consideration.
Okay, we'll take another round of questions. Dr. Shala.
Hi, my name is Ali Shala, an economist. My question is addressed to Nadim on the study. I'm wondering if agriculture is the biggest user of water through irrigation in the economy. Why wouldn't, I think farmers made up only, you've interviewed only 100 farmers or something more or less, while other sectors were much more represented in your sample. So why is it so? And why did I have the feel that they could have been a bit more in-depth studying of their practices or any changes, or at least to try and get a more concrete feel of what their costs may have been due to this drought, and whether there could have been more probing into this. That's it.
Any more questions? No? Okay.
Okay.
Mr. Farajalla.
Thank you very much, Ali, for your question. We talked to 100 farmers in the Beqa, in Fardibian, and some in the north. As you can imagine, it is much easier for us to open a book and find the institutions that are represented in industry and in tourism. Farmers themselves you have to know them individually to go after them. And they were quite representative as a sample. It was they were not underrepresented. 104 people. We talked to 104 farmers from Ras Baalbek area into the central Beqa area. So we covered the entire region. I mean, we're talking about regional coverage. And then we talked to people in the mountains, in the Fardibian area, and in the Akkar region as well. So we covered that. We couldn't talk to people in the south as much as we wanted. But that was quite representative. What we are limited in what we can present here in time, but we did go in depth to what each farmer had done in terms of reduction in area that's planted, changing crops. We'll be including that in the report, but here we've got barely 20 minutes to present all this, and I even with that I went over time. So, but we have that, it will be in the report.
So if I can add something, as you know, most farmers in Lebanon don't actually keep records of what they do. So this is more like a comparison between you're asking them what they did a year ago and what they're doing now, and to give a comparison. So that's also tricky. You cannot get much details on these things. So we tried as much as possible. Okay, two questions.
Other countries have been implementing and are contemplating some form of climate tax to provide income that would cover the investments necessary to produce green energy. Is this something we're considering in Lebanon? Because all the scenarios that you have shown are losing, basically. So we're losing a lot or losing a little. How much does it cost, and are we planning to get some income? Because when you raise the cost of energy, it could even reduce the consumption level. Well, as you've seen in the water case, when people had to pay more, they consumed less. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Karim, and I have a question about the dams that are being planned for Lebanon. Do you believe that these dams will support your efforts for water resources and hydroelectric power, or hinder or go against those efforts?
For the first question on the climate tax, we did this assessment already. The plausibility of having a sort of a carbon tax in Lebanon, or maybe an energy tax, fossil fuel tax. The first step would be on a timeline is first to solve the problems we have and maybe raise revenues from possible sectors before we impose additional taxes. For example, we have subsidies. We have fossil fuel subsidies that needs to be removed, where this will either raise revenues or diminish the expenditures we are spending on these subsidies. The first and the largest fiscal burden we have is the treasury transfers we're giving to EDL, the Electricité du Liban, which is making huge amounts of losses. So before we look around for additional sources of revenues or taxes that we can impose on the consumer, we should be able to remove these subsidies let the consumer pay the externality that he is making. For example, from burning gasoline in cars, we have very low excise rate in Lebanon compared to what it should be. And maybe, hopefully, at a later stage, this can be proposed. But yes, it's plausible. And many countries have it in different forms. So in some form, it could be plausible in Lebanon, but only after we make the necessary changes in the economy. Regarding dams, as I mentioned in the study, we only considered cost criteria because the other criteria, environmental and social, are very controversial. At the Ministry of Environment, many studies are being done for this kind of assessment, environmental assessment of building dams. EIAs are being done. So it's not under my area of expertise. But in this study, we wanted to showcase in a way. We didn't want to go into the specifics of each technology. We wanted to showcase that in a number of mixes, renewable energy is cheaper than conventional power plants. But maybe at the end, if a study is done environmentally, maybe dams have other externalities, have other harm for the environment, that we may shift from hydroelectric to the potential sources of solar and wind, where they don't have necessarily these controversial issues. But yes, these issues should be considered, of course.
Just for the dams question. As you could see, we were losing snow cover, and snow is where the main source of recharge for our groundwater, not rainfall and runoff. So as the snow cover shrinks, most of the precipitation that we're going to be getting is going to be in the form of rain and runoff, and that you can only trap through dams. Properly designed dams, properly located dams, properly maintained dams are not necessarily the evil that many make them out to be. This is a necessity that we would have to get. But in the long run, there is no escaping dams. In the interim, and until we get to the construction and the use of dams, there are many little things that can be done on demand management and control as preservation and conservation of a resource. There are changing in demand, changing in improvement in conveyance and losses in our systems. Once these are under control, then we can save enough water to maybe put off dams. But then, as you can see, dams have a dual function that is excellent, in the sense that it stores water for you and is a source for hydropower. So I'm not against dams.
Okay, we're running out of time, so we're going to take a 10-minute break, and then we will come back to our second part. We will have another session of Q&A, and you will also have a chance to address questions to the speakers that are on this panel. We'll take 10 minutes. Thank you. Okay, so we will start now with the second part of our panel. We are really very lucky today to have with us three very prominent speakers. I will start with introducing Michael Lahr. He is a research professor at Edward Blaustein School of Planning and Public Policy at Rutgers University. The general theme of his funded work is regional economic development issues. He is part of a National Science Foundation project team that is improving economic forecasting models so they are better posed to measure the long-run economic impacts of climate change. He is also the Associate Director of Rutgers Economic Advisory Service. He presently is Vice President of the International Input-Output Association and is the immediate past president of the Southern Regional Science Association. He is on the board of associate editors for the Journal of Regional Science, Economic Systems Research, and the Papers in Regional Science, and the co-managing editor of the Review of Regional Studies. His presentation will be on integrating physical and social models of climate change and initial foray. Our second speaker will be Flavio Vieira. Right? He completed his postdoctorate at the University of Glasgow Department of Economics in 2010 under the supervision of Professor Ronald MacDonald after completing his PhD in Economics, University of New Hampshire in 2002. He is currently associate professor at the Economics Institute of the Federal University of Uberlândia. His concentration is in economics with an emphasis in international economics, macroeconomics, and econometrics, and work applied to the emerging economies. He has done extensive work on panel data models and growth, exchange rate misalignment, transition exchange regimes, capital flows, economic growth, and institutions. His presentation will be on trade, growth, and climate change in the Middle East, and analysis for Lebanon, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. Eduardo Haddad is professor at the Department of Economics at the University of Sao Paulo, Brazil, where he directs the Regional and Urban Economics Lab Nereus, which we are happy that we have a memorandum of partnership with as the IFI. He also holds a position as affiliate research professor at the Regional Economics Applications Laboratory at the University of Illinois, USA. His research focuses on large-scale modeling of multi-regional economic systems with special interest in modeling integration applied to transportation, climate change, and spatial interaction. He is currently on sabbatical as a visitor at the Department of Economics, International Economics Section at Princeton University, and at the Edward Blaustein School of Public Policy and Planning at Rutgers University. His presentation will be on climate change in Lebanon, higher order regional impacts from agriculture, with brief discussions on some insights from the Brazilian experience and potential areas for further collaboration. We'll start with Dr. Lahr.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here. I just want to let you know ahead of time that before I came, I was told one of my colleagues that I was coming here to give a talk before a very large group of people in Lebanon, and he just said, make sure you wear a nice tie, so I hope you like it. Today, I'll be talking about what we're doing, and I'm going to quickly focus, as you'll see, I'm going to talk about this large-scale project. We have something like 50 researchers working on it, both at our lab and as well as in the National Center for Climate Assessment. So I'm going to talk about the study's purpose, the scale of analysis, and then I'll give you some quick flow charts about really what I'm doing and some of the others I'm doing immediately next to us. Much of it's like what Leila was talking about earlier. We don't have a real aspect dealing with drought, since New Jersey is not bound to get that with climate change. Then I'll deal eventually with land use, which I think is something that's probably not been addressed here as much and probably should be. And I'll discuss what the procedures we're going to go through with that, showing you the links to the other models, some core relationships with potential flooding along the coast, and some flow charts of logic, and that'll show you example simulation. So this is kind of the whole thing that we're working with NCAR, which is the National Center for Climate Assessment and Research, and they're the physical modelers. They show us how the climate will change, and we're linking that to really three sets of models. One is these two electric market models, some of which we heard about before. One of these is what's called DASER, which is planning out the hourly wholesale prices of energy. It's not just daily or annual, it's hourly, and there are reasons for this, which maybe I should mention now, which is that climate change is not just, we're expected to get something like 2 degrees C rise over the next 35 years. So it's a gradual change, doesn't seem like much. But what's really going to happen is increasing variation. And so we're going to run into these problems of peak load versus non-peak load, and that happens here as well. That is, on a daily basis, the average may be the same, but we'll go lower in lows and much higher on highs, and it may be just for 1 hour, and that 1 hour must be met by the electric power system somehow. And that's going to be much more expensive electricity, probably in the form of natural gas, as you saw, one of the cheapest loads that you can turn on quickly. You can't turn on solar, you can't turn on water power, you can't turn on wind, but the natural gas you can. It's a little bit expensive, more expensive than some of the others, but it's what we assume is the base load. And so that's going to increase that. So we then have an optimization program that can determine on the long run what the best electric power system would be, and that's kind of what you were hearing about earlier. And then we have, this feeds into a system, a econometric model for forecasting, and that's to get the wholesale prices into retail prices to get the change in demand, so you get the supply. And we're improving that model, and this is really my thing, which I'm not going to talk about today, which is I'm improving that model because if you know about forecasting models, after a while they just kind of go straight. And the idea is we're going to articulate certain aspects like the household consumption and other things to make that vary a little bit more over time with cohorts. And to do that, we're going to have kind of a combination of CGE model and forecasting model using both of kind of these guys' expertise. And you're working with them, but we're producing a set of SAMs over time out into the future and where we can do CGEs to give the shocks and so forth. So that's kind of the overview of the model. And then this feeds into a land use model, which I'm going to talk about much more detail later. So this is the CESM. This is showing you up here above on the upper part the basically conveyor belt system. It has that takes that into account of the flows of the seawater and as it comes off the ice melts of the poles, and it also takes the vertical differences and it shows that flow. So you get this full three-dimensional thing that they're articulating in this. So it's called a multi-scale ocean model with high resolution and its dense water overflow. The whole thing is what they're doing. We're taking out that affects then the atmosphere, which they then take out to a very detailed level, 0.25 degrees in longitude and latitude. So those squares you see, this is New Jersey is somewhere way north of that, next to south of New York. That's where I'm going to be talking about. And what we need for them, for special coastal communities, is things on the mean state, which is the wind, changes in wind speed, changes in humidity, changes in temperature. They can give us all this. And one thing they can't give us right now, which we're asking for, is the change in extreme events. This is something not important here in Lebanon so much. You may have more or less of them, but you don't have quite so much the impacts that we'll have from the ocean. While you have surges, they're not quite as strong as ours. The winds probably won't be quite as severe as what we'll have, but ours will be an extreme case for you, so you'll see some of the results from that. So then they take those results and extrapolate in ways us economists could never do. They take those 0.25 degrees and take it down to 6-meter areas, and they forecast the weather at 6 meters above the ground, 6 meters square. If we did that, Eduardo, they'd kill us. They'd put us with pitchforks and stuff, thinking we're crazy, because how can we do social stuff at 6-meter intervals? So this shows you then how their model will feed into essentially ours. We see the projected surface temperatures. This actually is feeding into the power scenarios because you can imagine that the air temperatures and water temperatures affect the ability of these plants to cool. When they can't cool well, they're less efficient. Electricity becomes more expensive, and that feeds then into the economic model in this way. And also that economic model produces the emissions, and then feeds back into the climate model. So the idea was to have these models talking to each other. That was the big story. Nobody's done that before. This is a new thing. Usually we take what the physical modelers do and we do it, and we don't feed back to them too much. This is the idea, is to have these things talking and have it move around and talk to each other. It hasn't happened yet. So you're going to see it is after 3 years. We still haven't gotten to talking to physical people. We've gotten their data. They haven't gotten ours. And they haven't given us all we wanted. So this is still preliminary results. This is showing you can't read it, how the economic model works. It's taking price and income effects due to changes in the price of energy. So people, the prices go up, they can't buy as much, it affects that. But also as the energy price rises, it dampens the costs of labor. Companies are less willing to pay labor, which means people don't have as much to buy and money to buy. So prices are rising, and they don't have as much money to buy. This then affects the economy in certain ways. In addition, the electricity model affects obviously it affects consumption in other ways. Utility output is raised or lowered based on this, probably raised in this case, which may increase the prices there. They increase their employment or decrease it depending upon the wage rates and so forth, and that also feeds into the economy. And it turns out in all of the stuff that we're doing, the electric power plants are both the main polluters, the main sources of concern and risk, because if power goes out due to wind or storms, it causes major problems. So for us, they're the center of everything. We have the same problem with power mix that you do. We can't have any more renewable resources than 20%. If we do, we run into grid problems. Again, reliability issues, as we mentioned before. And so we can't go much more than 80%. We have to keep 80% fossil fuel base, which is a real problem because those are people, that's what's polluting, and that's what's causing the climate change. It ends up being a real problem. The only thing we do is conservation of energy and make sure that we don't use as much energy and find new ways to be more efficient in the use of it. This is the land use model, and it's a little bit more separate than the rest. This is showing how we take the initial built environment. We know what it is. We see we have to have storm events and sea level rise, which is at the bottom, which affects, does the flooding. This affects property values at the bottom. And there's some things wrong, written wrong. This private real estate box should say rebuild or relocate, not reallocate. A little bit wrong. Anyway, the private impacts then make decisions on the real estate, whether to rebuild or relocate, because if it's flooding too much, I even go there, and the government can buy those properties, which it has done, is actually moved whole towns away from the Mississippi River, for example, in the past, moved them about 20 miles away, just because they kept on causing flooding issues and getting insurance, and it was getting cheaper to move them to give them insurance. And that's the other thing is policies, public land policies on regulating land use and what you can do to make it so it's less vulnerable to the surges and to sea level rise. And then these things feed into federal policies, which are land use zoning maps, this 100-year floodplain, these kind of things. And those affect the flood insurance rates and then the damage ability for the flood insurance to pay. So this is the land use model. And this shows you, this is New Jersey, it's about the size of Lebanon. The flooding areas, the areas that are most likely to be affected by sea level rises, the areas that are yellow are those that are less likely to be affected. Fortunately, I live all the way over here. Oh, I'm about 50 feet above the river on that side, so I'm in good shape. That was just accidental. It's where I just happen to live. But you can see that a lot of areas are likely to be hit, and a lot of those were hit during Sandy, which is one of the example things. It was the first time in 100 years we had a flood like that, and it was worse than that one, partly because of so much development that has occurred since then. This is one that shows you the probabilities, given the different types of sea level rises, what would be the effect, and you can see that a sea level rise of something like 1.2, all the way to the right, 1.2 meters, causes something like a 13-meter surge. So you can see just a small sea level rise can affect things. Lebanon probably wouldn't have quite things that severe, but still a 6-meter surge could happen here with the 1-meter rise you might be forecast to have in the future. So the issues are not very different when it comes to that. So 6 meters can put a lot of Beirut underwater, simply placed. So that's why I decided to focus this. This is where we have the most commonalities. So I thought this would be a good area for me to focus on. These are things that we need to worry about. We have to worry about coastal retreat because these are barrier islands that we have, so you don't have that. So this causes property values to shift. We have municipalities there that their finances could collapse if they don't have enough properties to tax. They'd have real issues. We have increasing impervious cover issues as we build more parking lots. We have more roads. It's causing less groundwater to be absorbed and be used, and also just runs off and floods more areas. We also have solar farms, which could make us even more vulnerable in some ways. So the solar farms aren't always the cure. We think all these renewable resources are cures, but we already heard water resources are a problem. Winds kills birds as they fly through it. Here we have the solar farms are almost like impervious cover. So it's almost, they're all problematic. Nothing's a perfect solution. So there may be even more things we haven't thought of. That's what the question marks represent. So there are some adaptive responses we can do. We can have new municipal codes. In New Jersey, we're making sure everybody puts or along the coast, puts their buildings up on stilts or has something underneath. There's nothing on the first floor so they don't flood. We have available flood insurance if we can get it, if we can afford it. So we have to make some kind of ordinances available for that. We have intergovernmental transfers, so we maybe can have the state or the national government replenish those beaches, because it's not just the state of New Jersey that's doing that. So maybe in your case it would be the other areas, or maybe you can get other states once maybe Syria stabilizes. You can get them to subsidize your beaches, since they probably use them when things are better. And natural hazards management actions could also need to be handled. So, you have to have other types of things when you have storms coming in. You may need to replenish the dunes that we have dunes along our beaches, other natural things that would make it less vulnerable in the long run. So we have land use links to our macroeconomic model for land use changes. So if we have more retail, that gets put in there, that kind of space. Whether we have more households, population growth affects the household density, things like that. We have land use change, then feeds back in the economic model in terms of wealth, due to loss of wealth due to disinvestment, which is GDP loss, spending on adaptive projects, which means we have spending effects, and then flight decisions after it turns out if you have a series of many, say 3 or 4 major flood events in a year, businesses leave and go to another area. They would leave Lebanon, for example, go to Brazil. They're always welcome, you guys. Physical science models give projections of the sea level rises, storm surges, the frequency, magnitudes, and inland flooding, which is important. And then we have these agent-based models, as is engineering and planning modelers are tended to use this. We have simple curves that look at the probability, in this case, the probability of flood and the depth of that footage, the percentage of damage. These are simple engineering equations. Oh, there we go, talk about outages. And we also have damage loss curves as well. So we take all those simple curves, and these could be estimated econometrically if we so desired. In this case, we're just going to show a quick example. And we try to make it finding out what the total flood loss is to feed back into the economic model. And also to show what kind of damage we've done. We'd actually have this on maps at the local level to show what areas we think would be damaged due to we have the floodplain maps, we can work that in directly. So then we have this huge flow, and it's just simple logic flows that we have in the model. This, does this affect this? Yes. If so, then you can follow this whole thing. Do you have insurance? If so, then you can buy it. If you don't, well, then you may want to move, and it has all these decisions being made, and it's called NetLogo is the modeling system used for that. And then this is a forecasted flood depth. Now, this is not from the physical model. Again, they don't have those, but we took a randomized projection of what those would be over time and said, okay, let's see what it would look like if we had some function that had flood that looked like this. What would happen to property values over time, just as an example. And this is something, when the real data come, we would redo. We can see the total damage would peaked in certain years if you look back and forth. The peak year for the flood is the worst, but also the first year. So the first year gets people to mitigate somewhat, to adapt to the first one, and after that it's not so bad until we hit another peak year, the most peak year, and then after that people have mitigated. So there's certain spikes when we lose damage properties, and then people move away or they do some adaptive process. And then afterwards it's not so bad. And you can see, though, however, that the vacancy rates then change in the market. You can see that in certain types of areas, waterfront never loses because waterfront is always very valuable. But water view starts people not wanting to be near it. If they can't see it, what's the point of being near the water? And basically anything else also that's getting flooded also leaves. And then we can see transaction prices, which are always highly volatile, but you can see they have some base upward trend with some waterfront always being very high for the main part. But the idea is it's volatile with the flooding as well. And this is just showing some degree of reality. This is just a simulation of the future. And so that that's really all we've done so far to feed back in. The idea is, summary is that temperature change doesn't change much in a post-agricultural society. Much of Lebanon's is not agricultural. We have only 3% of our economy in New Jersey is agriculture. We do cranberries and blueberries and tomatoes. Storms and sea levels do make a difference to us. So that's something you might want to consider about your coast. It's a very important thing here. The prior use, we used a random manifestation, but it would be good to have something that had more fact-based, so we're trying to get that from them. The problem is getting all those variables we do have they don't know whether something's a storm or not. And so we'd have to have some collusion between precipitation, wind, and something else, and we define it. That's a storm at a certain level. That's what we're going to have to do, we're finding. We need to derive storm counts. We need to know whether they're knocking out electric power, whether they cause property damage, or they stop workplace commutes, because those are things that are really bad. You can imagine if you can't get into work for 3 weeks because the river's flooded and transit is down. If transit's down, then we have traffic problems like Beirut, which we're not used to. And that would cause some real problems for people because they wouldn't have the extra hour they're expected to come in there. They'd have shorter work days. People would be more tired. They'd be less productive. That's things we need to work about. So that's the end of my presentation. Okay. Flavio.
Good morning, and first of all, I would like to say thanks to Professor Nadim for the invitation to be part of this panel. Different than those two guys, I'm more like a macroeconomist, econometric, so what I have done here was just try to understand a little bit about trade, growth, and some issues on climate change, but not that much, to 3 countries, to Lebanon, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. So I'm just going to go through some of these charts that I have, and there was a bunch of econometrics that I tried to do, but then I try not to exaggerate it. So I'm just going to show you some of the results at the end. Well, basically, so we're going to look at the real GDP per capita growth and some of the export patterns for the 3 Middle East countries. Second goal is to investigate the effect of oil price shocks in export growth and GDP growth. And last but not least, to address the possible links of export growth, GDP growth, and some climate change. That's the only case for Lebanon. I didn't do that for the other ones, the other 2 countries, using basically some temperature gap variable and also total rain. Well, when you look at this, we can never, put climate change aside. Of course, the economists, sometimes we do tend to forget about this, but it's all related to the production. Eduardo will talk more about the agriculture in Lebanon, so this part he will explain you better. But then you have the economic growth, you have exports, and then you have productivity. So somehow this is, they are all related. So we should keep that in mind. Well, going back just to one of the variables that we are interested, when you look at the real GDP growth for Egypt, Lebanon, and Saudi Arabia, in average, they are not that different. Saudi Arabia has lower average growth rates, but for Egypt and Lebanon, it's not that much. This is just to have a general picture of, at least since the early 90s until 2013. But then when I tried to examine what was going on in terms of the agriculture, the industry, and oil price, then there is some difference here. If you look at the agriculture value added, you have, specifically for Egypt, it's higher, the agriculture value added, when compared to Lebanon and Saudi Arabia. Even for cereal yield, to have an idea of productivity here, Egypt, it's higher than the other 2 ones. So going back, here's the agricultural value added, and then when you go to industry value added, basically Saudi Arabia, it's higher, but this probably has to do with the oil industry. So there are some very significant difference in agriculture and the industry when you compare those 3 countries. Oil price, we know that it has been increasing since early 2000, but now this movement is going even down, lower than the value that we have here. So somehow we need to understand what this how this will affect growth and export for these countries. Of course, that for Lebanon, it's not a direct effect since Lebanon does not, really produce or export oil. Oil rents, it's a significant part of course, for Saudi Arabia. And also it's not, it still have some importance for Egypt, just to have an idea. Here's the difference between the value of the crude oil production and at the world price and the total cost of production. So this is, if you look at the, let's say, just at the end of the 2012 and 13 for Saudi Arabia, it's around almost 50% of GDP. So it's really that important. Well, then I try to move from this issue of growth and agriculture and industry to the export shares to see if this has been changed in the last 20 or plus years. There are some changes. We can see like for Saudi Arabia, it has like in the early 80s, it was an important share in Lebanon exports, but then it went down and it's pretty much close to what is Egypt. And then I try to see what has going on here, what was going on. And some countries have increased their share in Lebanon exports. Specifically, we can think about like South Africa. If you look at the blue bars, it went from basically nothing to almost 20%. So it has been shifting the export patterns for Lebanon. For Egypt, I'm not going to go too much on this because it's just like to compare those. I think we can just look at the pictures and see. But again, here, if you look at Egypt and the other two countries, Lebanon and Saudi Arabia, they don't represent that much. Same for Saudi Arabia. Egypt and Lebanon doesn't have a large share in Saudi Arabia exports. So it's a little bit different from those two compared a little bit with Lebanon. Well, what I did after that was just to give some, here we're kind of estimating, let me just explain very briefly. It was like a vector autoregressive model, but we have some limitations here, and I tried to do like some shocks in the oil price and see how export growth and GDP growth respond to that change or to that shock in the oil price. First one for Lebanon, there is some, in the beginning, you can look at the chart in the left side is for the growth, and the other one is for the export in Lebanon. So there's some negative effect in the beginning, but then it turns positive, and no, in the second one in the right, there's really nothing responding in terms of export growth for Lebanon if you shock the oil price. The results are not that much different, but a little bit important for the export growth in Egypt, the right side graph, but not for the first one, so you don't have that much an impact. And for Saudi Arabia, of course, there is. So the growth in Saudi Arabia has a positive impact. If there is an increase in oil price, of course, they will benefit from that. And usually it lasts like 6-7 years. So it's not really like a very short one. It's short run. The response, when you look at the right side figure, that's for the export growth in Saudi Arabia when you have a shock in the oil price. So this was just to have this general picture. And then I try to incorporate a little bit about the climate change in Lebanon, so we can at least have some idea here. And basically, I had just these two variables, the temperature gap, which is the difference between the maximum and minimum temperature, and the rain total. But the problem is that the data that I had, at least the ones that we had for the other paper, that Eduardo will make some detailed comments, it runs from 1980 to 2004. So it's still like 25 observations, which is not ideal, but to do this vector autoregressive models, I did it like with one leg and 2 legs, but I couldn't do it more than that because of the data, the number of the data was limited. But anyway, the top one is the response of the export growth in Lebanon due to this temperature gap. And so you can see it's not like a clear path. There are some, negative and positive impacts. So it's difficult to, with this data that we have, just to come out with a certain response. For rain total, it's changed a little bit. It's negative in the beginning, but then it's positive. So I need to do some extra investigation, get more data, or see if we can use maybe some different variables here in order to address export growth. And when you look at real GDP growth, also for Lebanon, but again, for the two variables, there's some positive response in the top chart, but it lasts like 2 or 3 years. But for rain total, we didn't get, it's just very close to zero most of the time. Well, after that, this is the econometrics part that I'm not going to explain at all. I mean, it doesn't make sense if most of the audience here, it's not like economists. But anyway, this is autoregressive distributed lags. Basically, what I was trying to do here is to understand, can I have any long-run relationship or co-integration if I try to understand growth for Lebanon, for Saudi Arabia, and for Egypt. Basically, those are the variables, the real GDP, real per capita GDP growth, agriculture value added, industry value added. So this is what I call the first model, just to look at agriculture and industry. Then we add export growth, investment, government. Government is to capture like fiscal sustainability, inflation to capture macroeconomic stability, and in some case, if I do not have data or the whole data for export growth, you can also try trade and see which is the degree of openness. Here I name it trade, but it's the degree of openness. I did have data from 1980 to 2014 for Egypt and for Saudi Arabia, but then for Lebanon, the data that I had starts in 1989, so that might be a problem. We are going to see that there is no long-run relationship for Lebanon, but I can try later and see if I can re-specify the model. So model 1, it's this. Model 2, you just include export growth or trade and investment. And model 3, it's the less parsimonious one. It's probably the one that you can have more, chances to find this kind of long-run relationship. So for Lebanon, those are the results. But anyway, what matters is that we didn't find the no co-integration for all 3 models. Again, it might be related to the starting point of 1989 for the growth variable that I had access. At least I might talk to Nadim and some other guys. They might help me with some prior data for this, and then I can re-estimate the model. Anyway, then for Egypt, we could find a long-run relationship for model 2 and 3. Remember, model 3 is the one that has more variables, and it's more close to what the people from the growth literature, the empirical literature has done. So there's some evidence here for Egypt, model 2 and 3, and for Saudi Arabia. Also, there is a long-run relationship for models 2 and 3. But regardless of those numbers or the estimated coefficients, you can see that there's some difference among which the ones that are in bold. It's pretty much the coefficients that are significant. The other ones are not, but you can see that there are some differences here in which variables are playing or not a significant role to explain economic growth in these 3 countries. I'm pretty much finishing just. So some similarities in average GDP growth, but not exactly the same, but it's not that different. There has been some significant change in export shares. I didn't use all the other countries that are shifting their shares in the export of these 3 countries, but you can have an idea these are changing. Well, total rain and change in temperature have some, I put here some significant, but it's more like a short-run impact, so we cannot really trace this like as a long-run impact. Maybe, as I said, if I have some other variables actually we do have some other variables, I can try it later. And the determinants of real GDP growth are not really similar for these 3 countries. Thanks. Okay.
You can start.
Do you want to?
No, it's okay.
No?
So, good afternoon. I would like to start my talk thanking my dear friend Nadim for putting together this panel. It's part of our research partnership that's going on for almost 3 years now. That's been renewed for the next 5 years. Also, I'd like to thank all the support that was given by Rana and Patricia. Really appreciate that. And also, I'd like to say that when we give this kind of talk, we all say that we are happy to be here, etc., etc. And in my specific case, I'm really happy to be here, and I mean that. You may have noticed my family name is Haddad. My family is from Feluha, and I'm really, really proud to be here sharing with you this research. And the research will be about the economics of climate change, insights from integrated assessment model experience for Lebanon and Brazil. And the first question that raises, why Lebanon and Brazil? When you look at some indicators, we see that we have two completely different countries. You may notice that I have changed one of the information in one of the indicators here, right? And if you look carefully, you see that's related to the FIFA ranking, right? But I'm trying to help Lebanon in this way, but we are the one that need more help at this moment in terms of soccer. But you see two completely different economies with many, why would people want to talk about Lebanon and Brazil? And that comes back to similarities, right? These are this is Feluha, this is São Paulo where I live. And if you look at the population in Brazil, we're talking about more Lebanese people in Brazil than in Lebanon. Estimates range from 7 million to 10 million, if depending on the accounts that you make. And that's one of the reasons that brought me here. And making a long story short, basically, I came to give a talk at the Department of Economics here at the UB in 2012. I set an appointment with Nadim, since we had common interests in climate change. And as we met, actually was a very nice meeting, and we decided to do something together. I wanted to do research on Lebanon. Actually, I had come here in 2012 because after my first visit in Lebanon, for family reasons in 2010, I said, I have to come back to this country. And I started doing research on Lebanon by myself. I got a grant to do modeling, a regional modeling of Lebanese economy, building interregional input-output system for the country, building an interregional CG model for the country so that people here could use it for in their own research, and that this information is available on the website, so you can download the files and use this information. And after my presentation, I came to talk to Nadim and said, oh, we have a window of opportunity here. Let's start. We put together, we put together a memorandum of partnership to undertake collaborative research in the economics of climate change. And the first project we did was, I'll present as part of my presentations, to look at the higher order impacts of agriculture on Lebanon and looking at the governorate level. So basically, given this background, we are now having 5 more years to go. We are going to have just renewed the agreement. We'll develop new tools, and basically what the focus of all this research is has a lot to do with the topic of this panel, which is the cost of doing nothing, right? We are developing integrated models, using an economic model as the core of the system, to provide model-based information for policymakers of the potential costs of climate change. Can be even long-term change, or even if we're talking about the increase in the frequency of extreme events. So we give that, it gives us a numerical reference for us to put into perspective what if we do something, right? What if we have adaptation policies? Are they economic viable or not, given the potential cost that we are estimating in this project, for instance? So what I'm going to do, I'll start showing briefly the way we are working in Brazil. Actually, I'm going to show you the results of the main integrated modeling assessment that we did for Brazil. It starts in 2007, 2009. That was the milestone study for what's going on in Brazil nowadays in terms of researching related to climate change. And then I'll go through the AUB USP study related to what we did. And then I'll have some highlights of few studies trying to help us understand what are the potential next steps that we may pursue in terms of the whole project. Basically, how we worked in the first Brazilian study after the Stern review. The British government realized that something should be done specifically for Brazil, considering the key role of the Amazon region, and they sponsored a big study, like in the same structure of the Stern report, trying to basically getting together all the experts in the various areas of the various fields related to the problem. That's actually one first attempt to look at an integrated modeling for a developing country for looking at the economic cost of climate change. Actually, one of the two studies for a developed country that's actually mentioned in the IPCC report. And as I mentioned, it became a milestone for other countries. Basically, we have all this complex structure: global warming, climate change, energy, competition, agriculture. But there is a key message here. And the key message is that we should look at this problem from a sectoral point of view, but has to be integrated. We cannot disconnect, for instance, these studies of water resources from studies of energy, food security, population movements. It's everything interconnected, and we should pursue a way of understanding these connections and, if possible, putting that in an integrated framework. For the case of Brazil, we started with a global forecast. There was a lot of effort of downscaling the climate projections at a very local level. We got maps that were projected for various climate variables. This information was the basis for all experts in the various fields. And basically, from an economic perspective, we were at the end of the modeling chain. And basically, there was at this stage what people are doing was using what we call technically soft links. One model would feed the other model, but no feedbacks, only semi-iterative feedbacks. I would give you my results to the energy model. The energy model would give it back to me, but we would operate in different computational environments. But basically, how it works, we have, for instance, the land use model producing estimates of change in the allocation of land to agriculture, pasture, and forestry. And this is just, I'll be showing maps just for you to have in mind that we have a very heterogeneous impact across the country. Right? We also had agricultural productivity model that would look at the impact of a climate scenario on crop yields, different crop yields in different regions, and again, for each different crops, we would have different spatial impacts. Those maps relate to soybeans and sugarcane, for instance. We looked at, I think, almost 20 different crops for Brazil. We also had an energy model that would give us percentage, the change in the energy matrix. We would put all this together and try to transform the physical change, and that's the main challenge, the physical change into economic variables. We run the model, we get estimates in which, for instance, what you saw, how the results I'm going to show you, we are going to have a baseline, which is the scenario for the economy without climate change. Then we include the scenario of climate change. You get another trend. We compute the difference between the two curves, bring at present value, and here there is a discussion related to the discount rate to use, but you play with different discount rates. And then we get the costs of climate change for a given variable, right? So, and we had results for very many different regions, but one of the results that were mostly reported in the news was related to an economic variable. Basically, these results are just to present values. The loss related to climate change would range between 700 billion reais, and the exchange rate was around 2 at this time, to 3.6 trillion. When we put these results, that's in 40 years, when these results were released, was a big noise in Brazil. Of course, people would get the news. They got the highest cost possible, and actually initially we are a little bit uncomfortable with that, because as we did the proper scientific way, we had a range of results, but actually acted favorably for in a communication point of view, so that people start getting pay attention to this in the country. Actually, we also then one important thing is that we also had to go. Brazil is divided into 27 states. Actually, the smaller state is about twice the size of Lebanon, just for you to have an idea. So we are now in our model, since the regional model, we are able to generate also regional results, and also it was also, these results were also very important in communication, as it called the attention for regional residents to the problem. So that's for São Paulo, also for other regions. It's in Portuguese, but you get the idea. So this is a study. This is the kind of study that we did. And then what I'm going to show you now is some results of our first project related to the agriculture sector. There is one caveat that we have to have in mind, is related to the downscaling of climate projections. Right? You have to have in mind that the global models, usually they use relatively low definitions when we want to look at smaller territorial areas. And that's pretty much the case of Lebanon, right? We have to rely on various forms of downscaling these projections, and it still brings some uncertainty to the results. But we have to have in mind that we shouldn't stop doing this research because we don't have the ideal data, right? We just have to make sure that when we report the results, people know about the limitations of our results. We decided to do that. My point is that even though despite its small size, Lebanon still has strong regional differences. I got 6 maps from Atlas du Liban, but just for you to show, this is we have difference in terms of manufacturing, we have difference in terms of agriculture and services, for instance. And of course, we would expect, given the geography of the agricultural sector in Lebanon, we would expect that regions would respond differently to change in climate. So we use this model, that's the model we developed for Lebanon, to simulate the higher order impacts of climate change. That model, it considers interregional and intersectoral linkage through trade flows, through migration flows, and also through price effects. So it gives us a picture of the country. We can take this picture to the future and without climate change, and then we have another picture when we introduce the impacts of climate change in the agriculture sector. That was the simulation that we did. The model considers the 6 governorates of Lebanon, and in terms of sector aggregation, it's relatively very aggregate, but that's basically because of the information we have available through CAP. So, in the first part of the project, that's actually generated the publication as the inaugural article of a new journal called Region, which is the Journal of the European Regional Science Association, very important association for people that do regional and urban modeling. But what we did was to generate the baseline, right? We did that relying on scenarios for sectoral productivity and population growth in the regions without climate change, okay? In the second part of the project, let's incorporate the effects of global climate change, basically related to precipitation, change in precipitation patterns and temperature patterns, long-term averages, right? So use the same model, giving specific shocks to the agriculture sector, that I'll show you how we got the size of the shocks, so that we could generate the impacts that would redirect the future of regions in our simulations, right? And this new path, it would be related, when you compare the two paths, we would be able to assess the systemic effects of climate change. So how do you do this? Basically, what are the questions that are interested here? First one, what are the economic costs of climate change? And the second one, which regions are chiefly affected and to what magnitude? Right? Who are the potential gainers and losers when you try to assess the link between climate change, agriculture, productivity change, and the economy as a whole? And basically, we start again with, it's a very simple integrated framework. Basically, we received the climate variables from the physical model. We use some econometrics to estimate the change in productivity by crops, right? And we then have to change this physical change in productivity, in yields of crops, into change in the production functions of the agricultural sector, and then we get the systemic effects. We have this, basically we have a productivity, agriculture productive model. It's a model that deals with basically where we have 5 groups of crops: cereals, fruits, olives, industrial crops, and vegetables. For each one, we allocated this. We use these econometrics estimates to run some simulation to get what would be the impact over time. And basically, with the parameters that we estimated for the crop yield models, the climate scenarios that we got from the PRESIS model, and the regional distribution of crops in Lebanon, we built an index of productivity change that we then were able to put in the production function of the agriculture sector in each region, right? And based on the accumulated productivity change that we had, we were, for this is excluding Beirut, of course, it's this pattern here in which the related to productivity impacts of the scenarios that we looked at, the South and Abatie were the main vulnerable regions, right? That's still in the physical model. Then we use this information, right, to transform that into economic variables, basically shifting the production functions of the agriculture sector in each region, and then we get the systemic results. And that's a summary of the results. First, starting from agriculture, getting the higher order effects in the whole economy, this channel, climate change would hamper economic growth of the country, would reduce welfare of the population, would increase regional concentration, increase regional inequality, would put some pressure for immigration, and we could see that during the period of that we analyzed, the impacts are magnified over time. Right? Similar result. What would be? Can we get the present value of the total cost for GDP in the country as a whole, and can we have a stand on that? Yeah, we did this calculation, and we're talking about 20 years. We get the year-by-year costs, bring it at today value. We're talking about 2010. We're talking about 4.1 Lebanese pound, which is more or less 7.22% of the GDP for 2010. We got a number. Right? Is it right? Is it wrong? We don't know, but we got a number. We could get also in terms of welfare. And we also look at, we could get this information at the governorate level. And we see, for instance, I told you that southern Lebanon, Nabatea were the regions that are more affected, not only in the initial effect, but in total effect. But we see, for instance, that Beirut would also be affected by climate change. How does it go if basically an urban area without almost any agriculture there, right? And that's the beauty about this model, is because even though the Beirut didn't receive any productivity change shock, it's as the shocks propagates across the economic system, you'll see what's going on here. Tell is that potentially households in Beirut would be facing higher food prices. Potentially firms in the food-related business in Beirut would also be facing higher costs for their inputs. So that's what we are getting here, a systemic effect of a localized shock that gives us an idea about the total costs. Right? I'll come back to this point in another quick study that we did, because there is a lot of uncertainty related to that based on the parameterization of the model, and I will show you how we can deal with that. This is basically related to immigration. Also, what we're doing here, we are saying, what if we want to keep the baseline welfare level in each region, right? What would be the impact on population change? And basically, in this simulation, we're saying that there will be some pressure for people to leave the country. Consider if you want to keep the same welfare level. That's the way we're dealing with that. So what are the next steps? I'm going to show, let's discuss overcoming limitations. What I'm going to see is, I talked about a lot of uncertainty, about information that we have, but there are various sources of potential, not only uncertainty, and that's what we call a cascade of uncertainty, when you have this one model feed the other model, another model, but also in terms of potential inconsistency, because models use different theory, different data, the way we're dealing with dynamics from one model to the other, how we integrate, and so we have, that's a huge research area of improvement. That's why we keep doing that and improving since 2007, this modeling. But what I'm going to show 3 brief studies, 2 for Brazil, 1 for Lebanon, right? Which are 3 key areas of improvement of overcoming limitations. The first is downscaling, right? Professor Lahr showed you that in New Jersey, it's important to know not only what's going to happen in the whole state, but in specific areas, vulnerable areas of the state in terms of floods, right? Actually, we want to know what's going, I mean, what are the potential, no, we don't have, it's not a forecast, it's just we're looking at scenarios here, but we want to know what are the potential impacts in our home area, in our neighborhood, if we can, right? So that's one issue I want to do, to look at downscaling, impact analysis of related to downscaling and extreme events, and resilience. We want to know how regions respond, and if we have the right information to proper calibrate this response. And I'm going to show you one study that we did for the 2006 war, in which we are going to see how we model the impacts in the regions and what we did to try to get the proper response in terms of the economy, right? These we had, so I told you, we had for each state in Brazil, we had an estimate of the cost of economic change, right? But in each state, we're talking about, the state I'm showing to you is Minas Gerais, actually is my home state. It's the size of France, okay? And people want to know, the government was interested, no, well, I want to see what's going on inside. We have a very diverse economy, right? And I want to see, I want more information so that I can base my policy at the territorial level. So they decided, they had only this information, we had provided the costs for the state as a whole, and but they wanted to know which regions would potentially be more affected, right? We have such a diverse economy. Can you give us some light on that? And we used the model, I mean, it's another project, to get very specific. We divided the state in 66 regions. Now it's about 90% the size of Lebanon, the average region here. And you see that within the state, we had a differential spatial pattern in terms of the costs, right? Depending on the scenario, basically, we can build an economic vulnerability index to climate change related the size of the cost to the size of GDP, and basically for the state of Minas Gerais, the same, like in the same of Brazil, that's an interesting result. Most vulnerable regions in economic terms are the less developed regions. The national scale, the state of Minas Gerais, right? Of course, a lot of media on that, and that's one point I wanted to share with you. The other is related to impact analysis. I think Nadim had got these pictures from my presentation, but he was showing Lebanon, right? So we have a similar problem. The Brazil in the summer we had in São Paulo, we have this huge, the rain season, very urbanized area, we get a lot of frauds, and that's the kind of problem we get, right? So we decided to see, can you get the costs of these floods, and can actually more specifically for the city mayor, he wanted to know which of these flood points are generated the higher economic cost for the city, right? And what we did what basically we used some GIS techniques. So we got the data for one specific year, I think that's 2008. We had all the flood points. We took our students to survey the firms around the flood points, so that we could take a stand on well, what happens? Should we basically we wanted to calibrate the rate of the influence, the area of influence of each flood point, depending on them. We had very detailed information on the intensity, the time of the day, and things like that. So we cleaned that. We got actually, for various impact radios, we get the estimated foregone labor income, right? We use this information to get the higher order impacts, and actually, since São Paulo plays a very central role in the Brazilian economy, right? We're talking about 10 10% of the population, but 20% of GDP. We see that roughly we had an economy-wide total impact damage rate when you compare the output impact with the labor income, about 5. So for each dollar that was foregone because someone related to the foregone production, right, 4 more dollars were lost in the process, just to simplify the matter. And actually what we see is that the percentage of the impact that stays in the city, right, it's less than, the total of 40 out of less than 50%. So it's a local problem that generate higher order impacts that affect the whole country. And that's what's interesting about São Paulo, we're talking about the city of São Paulo, is that maybe what generated the flood is that people in the neighboring city threw garbage on the river, and that generated the problem that affected the city itself. So it's a payback. Well, we're able with this technique to assess which point generated the higher economic impact, right? So that with this information, São Paulo is divided in some local administrative units. We could get for them help them to allocate their budget for flood-related actions using this information. So that's something we are very proud of because actually it's been used by the mayor, that by the way is Haddad from Lebanon, not related. Well, again, big numbers, big press, and finally, it's about, we have this stream of research on unexpected events, right? Now, tell a story about this. We look at the economic cost of the 2006 war in Lebanon. Why we did that? We had a visitor in São Paulo, Professor Yasuhiro Kuyama. He's a Japanese professor with huge experience in looking at the impact of natural disasters, more specifically earthquakes in Japan. Right? It was just after I came here, and I was talking, I think Nadim referred to me this information about from the Council for Development and Reconstruction about the estimates of damage at the regional level, right? And they say, it's a problem that if we understand how the propagation of such an event, right, that's very localized, and either, if you look at the maps of the moment, in the south it's more scattered, but when you go to other governorates, it's very localized in specific infrastructure. If you can learn from that, we can see if you can apply this technique to extreme events such as sea level rise and things like that. We want to have a methodology that deals with destruction, localized destruction in capital stocks. So we did that, but our concern from a methodological point of view was to see if we could understand the total costs under different degrees of resilience, both technological and spatial. Right? And how we did that? Basically, we got the data for destruction of capital stocks by governorate, by sector. Right? We use that, we feed the model, and these are the results we got for macro regional effects. Right? This is before 8 come on. And we're very lucky because our model is calibrated for 2005. We have a picture of 2005, and most of the 8 arriving at the end of the year. So we can think that this brings some impact cost of the bombing in the country. But what we did, but there was an important issue is that we had to rely on on elasticities of substitution that were not estimated for Lebanon. Just speak from the literature, range of literature, and this brings a lot of uncertainty. But we can do what we say, qualitative analysis. We can run the model many times with different sets of elasticities. Right? And the different sets of elasticities that we'll be looking at relate to what we call spatial resilience. We are looking at how regions respond to change in relative price, right? Even if I cannot access the production of the South, right? How I change new patterns or I just cut production, right? So we did that using different sets of elasticities, and you see that these are surface for the impact on GDP in Lebanon. Actually, if you look at the total damage, the results come from 1.14 to 5.5, right? And here, that's the total cost in dollars, right? Here we have to take a stand in terms of where we are. We have to look at the Lebanese economy, understand its economic structure, see how flexible firms and households are to change their suppliers, to change their market. And since the Lebanese economy is relatively less complex than other larger economies, we think that's a discussion that we're doing, that we're more on a Leontief world, with low elasticities of substitution, generating higher costs in terms of what we would expect from a localized shock in the economy. This is very important, and that's important when we look at how regions in the country absorb a shock. And here we're talking about the capital stock change, right? Usually we can do that through trade. If you have high elasticities, right? If you can, we call this a higher degree of resilience. Oh, I cannot access my suppliers from the south, I'll buy from the north, or I'll buy from other countries, right? In that case, you don't get this so easily. So your elasticities are low, and you are not able to absorb shocks in a way that would give you a lowering negative impact. So this is an area that we have to work at, because during this process of building the interregional system, the CG model, looking at agricultural statistics, we almost relied, compared to, I would say Brazil has very good data, and even compared to other developed countries, we have very good data. We had to go from a situation in which you have very good data to a situation which have limited information. So we put a lot of effort on trying to deal with this limited information and try to get a way of showing that results with some credibility. That we put a lot of effort on that. Both in Brazil, both here, we are here because there is a very renewed, the last few years, interest in issues related to climate change. In the case of Brazil, since that first study that I mentioned, we have put together actually government, state agents, research agents in the private sector put a lot of money to finance a research network on climate change. Myself, I'm responsible for this sub-network on economics of climate change. And we've been focused a lot on, that's the research to try to keep the various fields with some regional, the coordinations with some regional representation. But we've been putting a lot of effort in terms of building what we call a Brazilian model of climate change, right? We are very advanced in this. We have already what we're doing is going from soft links. My model gives you some results. Model gives the other. The US, it seems, is going the same direction, but we already have a lot of hard links in the models. We did that. That's one of the focus, but we are looking at issues related to forecasting for the climate guys, a lot of effort on dealing with unscheduled events, in our case, natural disasters. From an economic perspective, financing and compensation schemes, not only at the sectoral level, but also at the regional level. And, of course, the issues that I mentioned related to model integration and downscaling. As part of our research, we have this agreement with Issam Institute that hopefully will have very productive the next 5 years, so that we can make some advance, not only from a methodological point of view, but most importantly to bring some policy insights for Lebanon. That's what I had to say. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these very interesting presentations. We'll have now some questions.
Well, thank you, obrigado, guys. Great presentations, the three of you. Actually, I have maybe a comment for Flavio. By the way, I'm Roland Riachi, a postdoctoral fellow here at Issam Faris. I'm an economist too. So, Flavio, why didn't you choose sectors that are directly impacted by not the whole export bundle? Like few grams of diamond getting from Switzerland won't be affected by climate change, but a ton of wheat for sure. Like, why not the agro-food industry? For Dr. Haddad, well, I was expecting more about the recent drought happening in Sao Paulo. We have 11 million people witnessing rationing for the first time in Brazil. You talked about flood, why not the drought also? Well, something a bit that was intriguing. How did you receive the GRP of Lebanon? Yeah, and something maybe for later. I don't know if you know that Lebanon imports 70% of its red meat from Brazil. So we are literally eating the Amazon here. So maybe forecasting something between Lebanon and Brazil, research project. Thank you.
First of all, thank you for all the presentations. I'm Dr. Emil Salami, PhD in agricultural economics. Well, I had a very similar question to Dr. Vieira. Can you please expand more on your model? Because there are plenty of sectors who are not affected by climate change if we want to agree that there is climate change. The other question is to Dr. Haddad. Slides 32, 33, something like this. You attribute there is a positive sign next to emigration. So how do you explain this? Is it because of climate change, people are emigrating?
How do you rate the quality of data in Lebanon? And specifically for Dr. Flavio, with 25 observations, you have lots of interpretation in your model. Huh? Thank you.
That's a major problem. I don't know if you know, and we are talking about the drought in Sao Paulo. Actually, we're talking about 11 million people is only in the city. When you look at the metropolitan region, we are talking about 20 million people. And basically, we are in a situation that's because of lack of planning, we are rationing water, right? And actually, how does related to my talk? One of the roles that this network, climate change network has is to provide information for policymakers in the government in Brazil. So we were asked to look at this issue more properly. That's something basically they want us to look to model possible financing schemes for water use in the given uncertainty about the drought. But that's a major issue. We have done, nobody did nothing yet because it's a recent issue, but it's a very nice problem from a research perspective, not from the reality. Estimated GRP, we published a paper in which, I will refer to you, in which we detail how we got all we came from the national estimates to the regional estimates using some survey data, what available was available in CAP. So it's a very detailed, it's basically the paper tells, oh, we have this information system already answering the question about quality of data in Lebanon, which compared even to other countries have worked on, the quality is low because it's missing a lot of information. But given this, how could you put together the system at the regional level? So a lot of assumptions were made, right? And we tried to validate the assumptions heuristically with other information for labor market and things like that. But I'll be glad to send you the paper and get your impressions of, yeah. Yeah, and actually, all the estimates all the estimates related to these are available in the website. So, but I'll be glad to show you all the details of that. It's a lot of information based on secondary data. What we could, yeah. I mean that's about meat exports. There are many people looking at land use and food production in Brazil. And there are people trying to, because basically having the fringe of the Amazon, first people take out the trees, put some pasture, right? This meat is exported a little bit to Lebanon, but a lot to Russia. They're the main. And then you cultivate. But now we're having a lot of, it's being very, increasing more and more the control of this area. And we have a very low density of cattle raising in Brazil. And what we are studying is that if you double the density, you have cattle production that can cover the projections for the next 20 years. So it's not that, it's more from a fiscal control point of view in terms of the fringe of the Amazon, which is very hard, right? We're developing a lot of combination of satellite with airplane monitoring, but it's amazing. The size is amazing. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. That's probably from it's illegal meat. Yeah, from the legal areas. Yeah. And the immigration. You asked about the immigration. What you're showing that here is that there is a pressure. If you want to, the computation that we made was that if I want to keep the same level of welfare in each governorate, given my baseline, the scenario without climate change, what would have been the population size that would keep that level constant? You have to reduce the population. Since all of the government would be negatively affected, we have now a demographic model. We interpret that as immigration. You have to leave the country to keep the same level of. But it's just this counterfactor as exercise, right? It's not that people will migrate, but there will be pressure. They say, "Oh, I'm not going to be as well off as I would without climate change." No, it's simulation based.
How this simulation will refer to reality?
Reality in this sense, if I'm living in Beirut, right? Climate change will affect crop yields in the south and Bekaa. I'm in Beirut consuming products that are produced in those regions. They're becoming more and more expensive because productivity is going down because of climate change, right? I have a business, I have a restaurant, I buy my inputs or to become change. So from a let's think about the household. If the cost of living is increasing, right? If I didn't have climate change, I had a lower a lower cost of living, my welfare would be higher, right? So to equalize the same welfare, I have to have less people to reduce the pressure in the demand. And then we would equalize the welfare level. It's a theoretical concept from economics, right? But basically, think about how per capita consumption. We are changing the capita. And so in our demographic account, we would need less people living there to get the same, to be as well off as in this scenario without climate change.
In our models, we found econometrically, it makes sense. A firm fails or your profits go down to nothing and start going negative. You can't stay there forever. Either if you're a farmer, you must move to the city, and if things are bad in the city, you have to go somewhere. In the U.S., things are much more fluid, probably in Brazil too, than in Lebanon. But the idea is something has to give.
Yeah.
People either starve or they move.
Try to understand that there is a pressure, an additional pressure for people to leave the country. Just that. If I want to keep my welfare level, which is a theoretical.
Maybe you can have a side discussion. Sure.
Well, I'll just mention briefly. Well, when I included the agriculture, value added, and the industry value added, I was just trying to those kind of sectors or trying to see if there is any sense of thinking, and there's a growing literature on this, that country who has a higher share of industry to the GDP will tend to grow more in the long run. So I did it but then at the same time, when I was looking at the exports, I just look at the destination to have an idea of the partners, but I didn't have the data at that time of the products. So that's probably another challenge to look at for Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, to see what kind of products they export or import. Then I confess that I didn't have really access to the data. And for macro data, it's not too bad. From the World Bank, IMF, this kind of database that I had was okay. But I guess that if you go to more like micro data, then you might end up in trouble compared to the macro data. But that's it.
I had one question for me, which is about firm interaction. Well, actually, the only thing that motivated this study that we're doing in the first place was probably the combination of Katrina and Sandy and firms' willingness to fund that kind of stuff in the first place. So they were interested in, to some degree, to have people working on it. Do they believe in climate change? Well, that's a different story. They're using they want solutions to their problems. And clearly, this will ultimately provide some kind of solution, at least in ways of planning the electric system better and worrying about things that with the economy and its effects. I mean, that's one thing that's not been articulated well in the U.S. I mean, obviously, Brazil's way ahead of us. We have piecemeal studies here and there. I think there are 9 different groups doing what I'm doing, and I'm only this group of 50 is one group, but of course they'd love whatever we do not to add taxes to them naturally, and they'd also one of the things that happened over a lot of businesses have just gone out and bought generators like you have. The lights go out.
Okay, any more questions?
Yes, I have a couple of questions to Dr. Haddad. The first is considering migration. I mean, you seem to have only considered that be immigration or immigration? Immigration. Okay, immigration. Did you have enough data, or have you considered internal migration as well? Because this seems to be always the outcome of in times of economic crisis or whatever kind of crisis. And the other question is your productivity data and the impact of climate change on productivity data. What were the data sources for these kind of data? Were they was it based on any disaggregated kind of database, or was it more on the aggregate side? Thank you.
My question is to Dr. Haddad too. In the Lebanese CGE model, the effects of climate change on the economy, this is only considering the agriculture sector, right? I'm surprised because the numbers are huge. When you discount it to the current year, the numbers are huge. So I was wondering, I mean, when you moved from the physical model to the CGE model, you considered the integration into all the economy. Was it also considered the effects on the food industry in Lebanon? Because this industry has the most added value in all of the chains of productivity, and nearly all the food industry in Lebanon relies on raw material and national products in Lebanon. But even considering this, I'm surprised why the number is this big.
Okay, last question.
My question is for Dr. Haddad as well. I'm sorry. Do you foresee any way in which the government in Brazil might use those environmental shocks in order to further marginalize developed regions or peoples? For example, I don't know if you've heard of the shock doctrine, where governments use environmental or economic shocks in order to change policies or in order to impose policies on people. Do you foresee any way in which the government might use environmental shocks to do that, and how?
Immigration, yeah. Actually, how the model works, there is when you in the function of the model, when you have what we call a long run simulation, we assume that the calibrated unemployment rates are the steady state. So basic what you do, we allow people to move from one region to the other so that they restore the observable or the calibrated unemployment rate. So there is, it's not, we don't observe the flow, but it's an adjustment mechanism that we use. Okay. Productivity, we relied on one study for the agriculture, one for manufacturing, one for total factor productivity. You see that the sectors are not, we just needed to have a baseline, so we had a baseline, so we just needed, and this model is called what's called a Johansen type CG model, in which it's fully linearized. We do it with percentage change. We don't need to observe the level. We just have to have scenarios for percentage change. So we did that for the agriculture sector, manufacturing, and the total economy. And then we made some computations to get the difference to services, and we applied to basically to sector one. One of the baselines, 2 and 3 for the manufacturing, the remaining 4. Yeah. But it's actually also the details are explained in this paper that I mentioned that came out in the. As for the size of the impacts, I'm talking about 7%, not year by year. I'm talking about 7% of the GDP. If I get all the let me see. If I get all the yearly impacts, right? I get the difference of the two marginal flows. I get the present value of the marginal flows, the difference between, basically I'm integrating the difference between the two curves and bring that value. And that is, in 20 years, is equivalent, the accumulated today, if I bring that to today, it's 7% of the GDP. If you say agriculture here is also not 5% of GDP. But for the agriculture itself, in 20 years, the specific cost would be half the production in 1 year. Also accumulate, that's also in the paper. And of course, if we have that for Brazil, the fully integrated model, and we're talking about 75% to 150% of GDP in 40 years. So it tends to, I mean, the more sectors we intervene in terms of the direct impact, if they are negatively affected, there is a very high likelihood that the impact will be higher. You know? That's a trick question in terms of environmental shocks. You're talking about environmental policy as a way of doing regional policy. I'll have to think about that. I don't have a precise answer for that, but I'll definitely think. Because what we have nowadays in terms of environmental policies as regional policies, basically at the rural areas, some initiatives with poor rural workers to get them in more in terms of training and some subsidized credit to get a proper way of dealing with it. But I have to think about that, and I promise to give you a proper response per email.
Okay, thank you all for being here today, and also I would like to thank our communications team, Alex and Rabia, and also Patricia Haidamous for helping organize this discussion. Thank you all.